Welcome to Flex Perspectives, where I interview the thought leaders, innovators, and executives shaping the future of flexible work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by the Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 4,500 companies, 30,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Shujaat Ahmad. Shujaat is the director of people analytics for LinkedIn, which has more than 20,000 employees and nearly 1 billion members worldwide. We'll discuss what people analytics is and the critical role the team has played in shaping LinkedIn's flexible work strategy. Shujaat will share actionable tips for creating a people analytics function and setting the team up to be a great partner to executives in shaping people strategy. Hello, and welcome to the Flex Perspectives podcast. I'm Rob Sadow, CEO and co-founder at Scoop. Today, we have Shujaat Ahmad, Director of People Analytics for LinkedIn, on the podcast. Shujaat particularly focuses on LinkedIn's future of work strategy and innovation. Shujaat, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Rob. Happy to be here.
No, it's a pleasure to have you. So I'd love to start by talking a little bit more about the interesting career change that you made. So you started as a strategy and operations consultant at Deloitte. I guess it wasn't the first thing you did in your career, but you spent a long time there before you moved over to LinkedIn. And when you went to LinkedIn, you started in people analytics. And so what inspired you to make that change?
It's interesting. So it was a radical career pivot, especially mid-career. It was about 6 years ago. So I'd been settled in strategy and operations, very established career, knew where the trajectory was going to be. And I'd been exploring in parallel that I wanted to do something around social impact, and I dabbed into, nonprofit a couple of times. But I realized then, and I was probably running away from it, was that my extracurricular around talent development, championing folks who are marginalized, also looking at unconventional talent, is something that I do effortlessly and get valued for. But it's difficult to accept it, right? Because in my executive MBA or in my consulting, that meant, so you want to move from corporate strategy into HR? Like, who does that? And so I had to go through a lot of learning and unlearning about myself. And I knew that I wanted to be in that space where I can guide business leaders. If I can get them to understand that where their strategy doesn't work is when they're not valuing talent. And if I can connect that to business outcomes, I will be able to push the needle around more authentic social impact through the people who are hired within the companies, and show how it drives innovation as well. And it went from a year of my own exploration, a project of meeting founders, people analytics people, my mentors around the US and globally. And then I landed on, okay, people analytics needs to be the means to an end for me to drive that vision. And the vision I painted was that I want the workplace to be not a platform for building resumes, but can I turn it into be a platform to building more purposeful lives while delivering business outcomes. And next thing I know, this is where I landed at people analytics at LinkedIn. And the role got sort of created during the interview.
And there really isn't, if I think about the different organizations you could have ended up in, LinkedIn is a pretty great one when it comes to caring about people and the orientation of the mission itself. So obviously it was a good choice on your end. Tell me a little bit about that experience at LinkedIn. So you've been there for almost 6 years, I believe. What does people analytics actually mean? And then tell me a little bit about what the vision for people analytics is at LinkedIn.
Got it. Yeah, so people analytics, it started off, it's Moneyball applied to companies, right? That's the simplest way, or the more fantasized way of explaining it. For us, we are in the business of myth busting. So we work directly with our executive leadership around talent and business. And how can we make sure that any talent decision is based on evidence and insight, and we can infuse insights-driven decision-making on talent, both on the talent side and on the business leader side? That, in a nutshell, is people analytics. It does get, for a lot of places, converted into just a reporting function. So for us, we were very cautious. When I was coming in as well, it was early days. It's how do we use reporting to get our foot in the door? But we eventually want to turn this into helping the talent advisors be more strategic in advising business. And then it has expanded from there and there. And again, naturally, like you said, with LinkedIn, we also operate as customer zero. Because if we can make LinkedIn better using insights. That's LinkedIn's product as well. It's their product roadmap as well. So LinkedIn can think about helping customers as well. So it's a lot of synergies, both like the vision, mission, and then what we're trying to do and prove as well.
So bring that to life a little bit. And we'll talk obviously about a number of topics related to people analytics, but just give an example of maybe a project or a topic that you've spent a lot of time on at LinkedIn, especially in the early days, maybe, and what it means to advise on that topic to an executive or some other part of the business.
Oh, absolutely. So there's like very near and dear to my heart, like the first one. So when I joined, I was in a consultative setup with our head of engineering and the head of talent for engineering, right? So in tech, that is challenging, but also the most impactful place you can be in. And very early, their question came up, all right, how should we think long-term around talent and location? And that was like a general concept a lot of other companies were exploring. And if you look in the industry, generally how people would look at those decisions is, all right, let's pick a few cities, few are favorite ones, few are not. Let's do an analysis, like high level, and then just prove a case that why do we need to move there? And that's where my business strategy lens came in. I was like, let's step back, let's put a framework to this. From a business aspect, like what would be required, what would we need to evaluate, then figure out, do we have the data internally or externally, and what kind of estimates we will have to make to help understand that, long term, you're not just looking at where the talent is. You want to see where the talent is going, what our strategy is as well. Does it make a financial sense as well? And that ended up at that same time, our product teams were exploring our product as well, of helping understand how can we give companies information to understand where talent is. And that ended up becoming one of the major use cases. And when the Talent Insights product was launched, I believe at our conference in 2018, we got invited to come and present and talk to all the leaders how you've actually ran this and help decide on our talent strategy as well, and location strategy as well. And a lot of that work then got converted into our playbooks as well. So that was very heartening, right? Because very rarely do you get a question in a company where the head of tech talent is asked and head of engineering is asked, like, have we taken our own medicine? Very rarely do you see in companies someone will give an example of HR. And I remember, our head saying that this is it. Like, we actually took this, and it's also feeding into what ended up becoming our product and how we're advising on that product to others as well.
I love that, because it's interesting, because some of the biggest products, I think, in the world now that have come out of large technology companies have started in that type of fashion. Like you gave, for example, the LinkedIn one. I think AWS obviously is a pretty famous one in terms of the use case internally at Amazon before being rolled out more broadly. And so it's very cool to both have that localized impact within your company, but also then be able to globalize it in some ways in terms of helping customers. So as I think about it a little bit, obviously there's a pretty heavy analytics element to what you described in terms of how do you actually conduct or analyze whatever underlying variables you're trying to look at for talent migration or whatever it might be. What other types of people or roles are on that team? Maybe for folks that are thinking about people analytics internally, and how do you staff that effectively in a company?
Got it. So when in the early days, as you were getting this going, I would say there was three set of roles and three sets of functions within this team. So HR data in any company is the last data most companies think about, right? It requires a lot of cleanup. A lot of times, the wrong connections have been made on the back end. So we knew that a lot of people analytics teams, when we look outside, will get stuck in being just reporting teams. And we can spend our entire lifetime building infrastructure for data, or the end goal is, our vision is, can we get better, faster talent decisions using the insights that we provide? So it was a trifecta, right? So we had, let's set up a consultative arm that works directly with our head of functions as well as head of HR COEs, our Center of Excellences, so that we can advise them not just on data, but also understand where their problems are and can we advise them to think differently about those. To support that, we set up a data infrastructure team that for the low-hanging fruit data, how do we make sure that it's so clean that we can easily access it, present it when it's ready, and run analysis on it? And then we had a third factor, which was let's forward looking, let's think about research. Like what are the things out there, like sentiment analytics and behavioral analytics that we haven't thought about that could come up with new metrics, get added to our data platform, and also feedback back from the consultants who are in the front line. So that's how we started. It's like you're trying to run, you're flying while you're building the plane. So as more and more use cases came up and we showed our value, the scope expanded and expanded from there, from just reporting to being more strategic as well.
It's pretty interesting because in a way, what you're describing almost feels like how some companies set up internal strategy organizations to advise the business. And effectively, you're taking people analytics and saying, look, instead of just being a reporting function, let's make it strategic in nature. And not only strategic, but let's make it advisory of the business. It's almost like setting up that consulting type of practice within a company, if I understand correctly.
It is spot on. And that's what we wanted to be. And that's where we landed as well. That as we delivered more value, we became the de facto, the talent strategy team, analytics team, advising our talent leadership, our CHRO, our CEO around how to think about this and, quarterbacking how strategy needs to be thought of.
Super cool. So I imagine, I could be wrong, but I imagine that what you focused on and spent time on prior to 2020 and the pandemic probably changed quite a bit, or at least evolved quite a bit once the pandemic hit. And so talk to me a little bit about where were you spending most of your time in those first years? And then when the pandemic hit, did that shift your focus and kind of how did you end up spending your team's resources at that point?
God. So, one of the values at LinkedIn that attracted me is our value around transformation, right? Transformation of self, the company, the world. So I've had the opportunities there for you. My roles kept evolving every year. So I started with engineering. Once I proved my point there, we expanded. I had a passion for diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So I was running that on the side. I also helping. So I became a consultant people analytics for diversity, inclusion, and belonging as well. And then my scope increased to broader COEs within talent as well. And just a year before the pandemic, I had this, following up from that geolocation strategy, I had a passion project that I think the war on talent is going to be on flexibility. I did in a blog post as well on it that went really viral with our clients and customers as they thought about this. And so I started exploring remote and flexibility as a research project on my own on the side. And I actually presented on it about a year before the pandemic.
I should have talked to you before the pandemic. I would have made very different investment decisions if I had known where the world was going based on what you already were seeing.
Exactly. But at that time, right, everyone was like, remote? Like, why do we think about remote? Like, so small scale. And the pandemic got hit. And I think a month or 2 months in, as the media hype got increased and companies were making big announcements, like smoke and mirror announcements, I got pulled in. They're like, you worked on this. What's your point of view? And as a task force was being set up. And I was like, all right, here's the thing. I think the point of view is the future isn't remote or on site. The future is flexible. And that's what we need to think about. And what we're hitting right now, my prior experience has been a disruption in business. So this is standard disruption. You don't know what you're walking into. We don't know how this pandemic comes out. So you will have to experiment your way in. You have to figure out some data will be there, some not be, and make decisions under uncertainty. And through there, eventually you will land on what works for the team and what works for the individual. So that landed in the first year of the pandemic. It was a very lean team. I got pulled in with our who now is the head of Flexwork, Shannon Hardy as well, around how do we think of a methodology and guide decision-making using insights around where should LinkedIn land. And we landed on that decision for going with hybrid and trusting our employees to do what's right for them and their team. So being flexible on flexibility. And I went back for paternity leave. I had my second one at that time, came back, and then, thank you. You've worked on this. You've helped us get signals and help just decide under uncertainty. So that's where I then built within People Analytics this new team on future work. That as we evolve post-pandemic, the main thing is we have to make sure that this is effective for the reasons that we picked this for, around make sure the cultural aspects, innovation, productivity, and we can myth bust around it. So I then took a sort of a detour, built the team, and then guide them back into what are some of the venture bets we need to answer that we've successfully answered over the years, and still answering like as we go on.
Got it. So I want to double back on something you said that I think is really interesting. Like you talked about looking with Shannon and others internally and analyzing different factors that led you to not only a point of view to focus on hybrid work, but specifically giving what we describe in the Flex Index as employees' choice, right? Some employee flexibility around when they choose to be in the office. That's a particularly interesting topic right now, obviously, right? With a lot of companies trying to figure out within hybrid, what approach are they going to take? Is it a minimum days a week, specific days a week, employees' choice? And so you obviously have been quite analytical and strategic in thinking about it. Talk to me a little bit more about how you came to that decision and what you were seeing in the data that led you to that feeling like the right answer for LinkedIn.
Got it. So I think, let me start with pre-pandemic, right? Pre-pandemic, looking at companies who were fully remote, as well as companies that were not remote, but had remote as a benefit offered to people as needed. And if you start thinking about tech, and then LinkedIn, we realized that, we were effectively operating in a distributed environment, right? So if you look at tech as well, most of the tech companies, their office utilization pre-pandemic as well was 60 to 70% was flexibility, right? You could be in the major campus in the Bay Area and people could be still dialing into web conferences because they can't find rooms, right? So he said, we're used to this, right? And that's why I think a lot of companies that did really well, including LinkedIn when the pandemic started, they were used to distributed work. They were not used to not having social interactions for a continued duration, but generally they were used to adapting to this. During the pandemic, we planted a few things, right? We said, all right, let's get feedback in as the pandemic is evolving from our employees around their needs, their preferences. And then as they learn more about this and start settling in as the pandemic starts to end or gets into more easier states, where would they want to be? Like what's working for them? From getting the work done, social interactions, flexibility, well-being was a major concern as well across all companies. Taking that in, then a second part was we looked at LinkedIn.com, right? There was surveys that we knew that for the talent pools, different talent pools that we're interested in, how are they rating flexibility, right, as a value proposition? And then the third one was the one where our unique value comes in, right? So for our surveys, we use Glint. We make sure that quarterly basis, we were projecting what might be the biases people might have, and we used to plan those into our survey so that we can myth bust. Then took external information as well from LinkedIn.com. And then lastly, we built our own framework. So we looked at, academic research around roles assessments and state, and then put our practitioner lens and came up with a framework to help evaluate the different roles at LinkedIn and see if can we do this and should we do this. And when we came to the conclusion, we realized that, pre-pandemic as well, everything was built around trust, right? Like people were still operating, were still doing well. Our remote population was, one of the most thriving populations at LinkedIn pre-pandemic as well. And then now as well, it's all about trust. Like what really works is the trust between the manager and the individual and the across the teams. Let's start with that. Like let's continue with that trust. And that landed that, okay, we know that remote could be easy, just fully remote or on-site. Hybrid is difficult, but that's where we need to be. And that's what we need to solve for. And we can't do a dogmatic announcement that do X or Y. We need to learn our way through and trust that the employees and teams will help us give that feedback.
I think that's so interesting because, it doesn't surprise me to hear, being familiar with LinkedIn as an organization, as an operating principle, that you would approach it that way. But noticeably absent, from the way you described it, was any type of qualitative feeling from executives on whether they believe in people being in the office or out of the office. I have to imagine somebody was trying to influence, or there were some folks that were saying, look, I don't really believe, or was LinkedIn just that that true to being analytical, that you're able to approach it in that type of objective way in terms of how you thought through the analysis and how you thought through the recommendations?
So I would say three things. Number one, all humans, right? Especially in this environment, there's so much information coming externally, internally, and anecdotally as well, right? You could talk to X and say, hey, it doesn't work for X, so let's say it doesn't work for everyone. I think that's where our risk-taking came in. When I built a team of data scientists, research scientists, you were not working on data science or research science. This is a decision science team. So you got to understand the art and science of it. So we knew that, all right, by this time, vaccines will come in and offices will start opening at some form. There will be biases or myths, right? And as people go through this pandemic, I had not gone through a pandemic. I had gone through some other uncertain situations before. So I had an idea like that as it prolongs, it'll have an impact on people's state and what they want to question about their life as well. So we heard all the anecdotes, made sure that we were in touch with the leaders, and said, okay, the best way to answer this is let's just ask the population, right? But ask it in the right way. So I think that's where your work is so valuable, because there's a lot of academics out there. There's a lot of reports and media hype. And the first question I ask is, they're like, oh, we figured out it's managers saying this is not productive. And I'm like, did you actually explain in the question in the survey what is productivity, right? Like, because there's bias built into it. And I think what you're doing is you're helping clean the bias as well and saying, all right, here's what companies decided what to do. Let's look at when they were created, like who's coming in, that data is helpful. So you have to walk everyone with you right through that journey. So planting very proactively, that knowing that by this quarter, this is a question that's going to come in. Let's anticipate that. Let's ask that beforehand in our surveys that we do, our employee voice surveys. Use that to inform discussions. And it's our own product, right? So there are natural discussions on a daily basis where someone will come in and say, you know what? I read these 10 articles. Maybe it doesn't work for us. And we're like, all right, based on what case studies? Let's look at those companies. Like, do they relate to us? And then secondly, easy thing. Let's ask our employees. Let's ask our managers as well. So within our voice service, we do ask our managers, like, how do you think about this? And that helped inform that, okay, you know what, this is where people are preferring and this is what they're seeing is working and not working. And not everything is working, right? Like, you're always evolving and improving on it. But that has to be done. People analytics can't just be, or any analytics team can't be just providing quantitative data. They have to understand qualitative. And that's why we brought in a huge emphasis on sentiment analytics and even behavioral analytics that we blend into this.
It makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that strikes me, and I'm curious if you agree based on what you said, is the amount of trust that your team probably had to build over time to have the standing to be able to approach it that way is significant. And so my instinct is all of the work that you did to lay the groundwork in the years before the pandemic probably enabled executives to be comfortable with you as partners in thinking through this and approaching the analytics in the right way, which maybe would have been more difficult if you just sprung up at that time to try and solve that question when there isn't that track record.
It is. And you know what? It's interesting. It goes both ways, right? It's again, going back to our operating priority of trust. Pre-pandemic, we joke around that, I think everything we were doing in people analytics as our scope was increasing was maybe getting ready for the pandemic. Because by the time the pandemic hit, we had built enough credibility and social equity that we got pulled into top priorities of the company with our CEO and our CHRO. And then when this was happening, it also goes both ways, right? The leadership trusting as well, that, okay, we have someone who's thinking passionately. There's a team thinking about this as well. Let's trust what they come back with. We can always poke holes and we can always ask questions, have our opinions, but trust them. We've hired the right people to do this. So I think that kind of trust and empowerment was very critical as part of our culture, and they saw the results from it.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I think a little bit earlier, that ultimately you made the decision that you effectively landed on what's closer to an employee's choice hybrid model, right? In terms of giving some employees flexibility. How did you ultimately, how did that get rolled out? And what have you learned or tweaked along the way based on what's happened since you kind of put that initial stake in the ground?
Got it. So I'll add something to your statement. We trust the employees to do what's the right thing for them and their team. And we were also, the data that we were gathering from them was around both anecdotal and quantitative, that how do we balance what works for the individual and that works for the team as well, right? And we have a high participation rate in our surveys, like employees trust when we ask them something. So we had a lot of open conversations and open comments around, works for me, but I need to make sure it works for my team as well, right? So I think that balance was very key. If you look at it, North America, companies went fully hybrid or being able to test hybrid was only till May 2022, right? When everything opened up and offices opened up. And in there as well, I think one of the areas of building trust is, there was fears outside, like, hey, companies are going to start bringing people back in. Trust is consistency over time. So even like in 2021, when we announced our strategy, and then a year later, it's consistent message from our leaders that, listen, we still stand by this. We trust everyone to figure out what's right for them and their team. Hybrid is what we're solving for, and make sure that it works, because it's the difficult part, while it enabling remote and on-site, right? Meeting people where they are. That consistent message, again and again, through our people manager meetings, to our broader company connect discussions, that's been key. And then the rollout has been that, yes, let's listen to managers. What do they need to be able to help support this? What's not working for them? Whether it's education, training, whether it's our workplace experience, our technology experience. And that's constantly happening now. It's more and more integrated. So the rollout still stands the same, like to the employees, but we see from our surveys as well that they're seeing that work is being done to constantly improve it.
That's great. So I want to shift a little bit toward actionable recommendations for maybe people leaders or other executives at companies that are hearing you talk about the experience at LinkedIn and are trying to figure out where should they start at their company if they want to approach something similar. So we'll talk about a few different things, but at first, if you are trying to build a people analytics function, or at least start down that path so you have some type of internal capability to advise and analyze on the topics that you're describing, what are the first couple of steps that a company should take in order to move in that direction?
Got it. So I think number one, I said 3 steps. Number one, you got to have the understanding that you got to invest in your data, right? The data cleanup, and understand that this is a strategy and an operations problem at the same time. So you need to understand that, hey, this is not just big picture thinking and advising. You need to see where the rubber meets the road, and that investment has to be there, and that investment takes a long time. So that's number one. Number two is understanding that we're going to trust the team, and in there, the consultative part comes in, that in order for people to be good consultants, if they're just submitting a report and nothing happens to it, right, or the right decision makers are not there, I think making sure that they have the right visibility and traction, and that hence why they're consulting directly with the executive team and the talent leadership team, because whatever they're sharing in data and research is going to get applied somewhere, right? Like that's the best opportunity. If you have to go through a lot of bureaucracy, you're going to be limiting yourself there. And then third is being open about innovation and experimenting, knowing that, while you invest in data, basic data is not going to solve for everything. It's going to give you just, a lot of lagging indicators. For you to get to leading indicators, let people experiment, right? Not be afraid of it. Maybe they take a smaller pilot or a team that's more interested, go run with it and see what the results are. Even if the results aren't positive or we didn't find anything, there will be some learning from it. And that experimentation part is very key for companies to go. A lot of time companies are focused on the first one, just the data investment, and then they're blaming the data for not providing strategic advice. So I think that the three factors are very, very key. And then specifically when you go to this topic about future work, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, where there's a lot of experimentation to be done. I can talk specifically about those, like how we set that up, and there's like a separate three aspects I think that are key for that.
Got it. That makes sense. And I love the way you frame that in some ways, it's a marriage between having the right clean data and analytic foundation with the ability to culturally enable experimentation and innovation so that you can not just look backward, but look forward. I think that's really well put. Maybe one piece in the direction in which you were headed, maybe for organizations that have someone or a team that is playing that role today, but maybe have not truly applied it yet toward how they think about flexible work. Maybe their flexible work policy is more driven by executive point of view on what they think is the right approach, less data driven in that way. And that's okay, but maybe that's something they want to evolve on. How do you recommend approaching the work of thinking through the right flexible work policy for your organization based on what you learned in the process that you ran at LinkedIn?
Brilliant question. I think this is the gold question for not just people analytics, for all analytics teams. A lot of analytics teams end up being analytics for the sake of analytics, right? The skill set that you bring in as well, data scientists, org psychologists, right? Consultants, people passionate about this topic, right? About this domain. They will look at, hey, let's do something cool. It's very easy to go into a rabbit hole, and Rob asks a question that wants to solve as an executive, and they're like, you know what? Here's 3 things I can come back to you. And we have to train ourselves, our teams, and our stakeholders. And it's an ongoing process that first ask the why. What are you trying to solve for? And I do see, and I do help as a sidekick, like other companies that are thinking about this. And you're right, either it's a real estate play only, either it's a cost play and hence real estate play, or it's like, hey, I think if co-location is not happening of people, I assume collaboration is not happening. I assume productivity and innovation is not happening without actually defining any one of those. And I think that's where we spend a lot of time working with leaders on what are all the things that you want to solve for, and having those hard conversations that you can't maximize for everything. What are you trying to optimize for? That what defines success for this? And then let us figure out what's available and what's not available. We will be creative about it. And that conversation landed on we are trying to solve for, make sure that it works, right, for the business. It's flexible, but it's also equitable. So how do we make sure culture-wise, talent-wise, diversity, equity, and inclusion-wise, but also from a productivity and innovation lens? How does this work? And so we set up some guardrails once we got everyone agreed that that is what we're solving for. Now let us come back and then on the way do myth busting. I think that has to be key. Again, goes back to, if it's a few executives saying this is exactly what I wanted to be, you've already seen this during the pandemic. I think the next 18 months, most companies are going to put cement slurry around their feet, and it's going to get solidified. And after that, it may be irreversible for them if they're not making the right decisions. Especially with the amount of employee activism that's going to come out of the pandemic. It already is, right, across companies. So in their understanding that, hey, we have opinions, let's look at data as well, and let's look at people who can guide this. It's a stand consulting problem. Get into an ambiguous situation, put structure to it, put a framework to it, and then say, all right, what do we know that can help guide us? What do we don't know? But let's follow a methodological way of trying to solve for it. And then last, have leadership courage to put a stamp on it.
Yeah. So maybe one last question. If you're a people analytics person, leader, maybe just an HR leader at a company, and you're listening to this podcast right now and saying, yes, this is what we need to do, but I'm just trying to figure out, how do I kind of raise my hand or get started in terms of the right first conversation to have? Any last pieces of advice in terms of kind of like what you should go do differently tomorrow, or how do you open up this conversation to start moving down the healthy path that you outlined?
Yeah, I think this may sound very, very simple, but it goes back to like what most of people analytics feels as well as an industry. You have to be closely working with the CHRO and then the CHRO with the rest of the C-suite to have that conversation around what is the problem that you're trying to solve for. What is it that you think it can't be solved? Bring us in, right? Help us think through it. Who are other parties in the company who can help us solve this for this as well? That conversation is key. If you're not having that conversation, you're going to do a lot of good work that's going to go nowhere, right? And you're no longer will have a team. I will say is think for, as a parting comment, I would say, look at 3 things. That's how we designed the team. And we ended up, it's one of the unique teams that's there, the future work team that we built. I would say 3 things. Number 1, being very clear from a skill set perspective. Now, you can have the conversation. How do you back yourself with that conversation once you get the mandate of go and solve this? Not 6 months, do it in a month, right? Show us some signals. I think number 1 is you're in the business of myth busting. So the skills you're bringing in is of decision science. That's a mix of data science, research science, influence. You have to understand that we're trying to get to a decision or avoid the wrong decision. Like that's the impact you're trying to create, not the best model, right, that you're trying to create. Number 2, have a lens, both the team that you build, and that was done culturally over the years for us. Be compassionately purposeful. Like, you know that you're trying to talk to executives and any biases. What are you solving for? You're solving for that you really believe that this future work is going to drive more equity. It is better for the company. It is just better for the world of work and the kind of places you want to work at. Like, you have to really believe in that. And then the third is have the innovation, be innovative, right? Because if you're autonomous, I have a very small team. If all of them are operating on their own and thinking, hey, this is what we need to solve for, they will come up with the best new ideas, right? You hire people who are smarter than you. And I think that's a part that if you can have some backing there, you will definitely be able to raise questions and answer as well.
That's great. And I love, Shujaat, the way that you blend both the theory of how to approach this, but just the practical understanding of timelines and the need to influence and build relationships. I just think just like any good consultant in a way, right? Like that's the right way to approach it. It makes a lot of sense. One thing we do before the end of every episode, just so everyone understands a little bit more about you and your background and what makes you tick, is I like to ask a set of rapid fire questions, if you don't mind. So I'll give you a few and I would love to hear your perspective. Does that sound good?
Go for it.
All right.
Yeah.
So first one, what was your very first job?
I was a maintenance engineer in a refinery.
Okay. So a lot of change over time, huh, in terms of roles. What's the best book you've read lately?
Lately, I would say Jacqueline Novogratz from the head of Acumen, her manifesto for a moral revolution. It's the book that I've been reading it through the year again and again. A lot of bunny ears in the book. A lot of marks I've put in. Constant reflection of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and why there needs to be purpose for it. Amazing book. Highly recommend it.
Cool. I'll have to check that out. All right. Video conference. When you're in a meeting, do you usually have video conference, your video on or video off?
Mostly on. Only off if it's a bad day of video fatigue.
Got it. What show or movie are you obsessed with right now?
Right now or ever?
It could be either, with a bias to recency, though. Maybe something of recent that you've watched.
Got it. Ever is The Wire. I think it blends in how metrics get used for the wrong incentives versus what's the real thing to do. And it was ahead of its time. It's pretty raw. I watched it a couple of times. I love it. Enjoy the ingenuity shown in that show as well. You can learn business from that show, learn life from that show really well. Most recent one, I think last year, was Severance. And then now the last season of Succession. I think is brilliant psychology and what happens when greed hits it.
I'm just starting the last season, so no spoilers, please. All right. Favorite snack when you are in the office?
In the office, it's the extra crunchy Raisin Bran. I'm a Raisin Bran fan, so I will just bring that in anytime.
I also love Raisin Bran. Favorite piece of software to support flexible work?
I think right now, for me, has been Teams. So when the pandemic started, I made Teams my central operating system for everything. It's worked amazing, and it's going to get even more amazing as AI kicks in even more that we're seeing. Love it.
Cool. Who is one future of work thinker or writer that you really respect?
Okay. Can I say two?
Sure.
All right. So I think so from an academic purpose, someone who early in the pandemic, I think gave a very good blueprint was Linda Grayton from LBS. And I think her article in HBR very early in the days on hybrid work, amazing. Just a strategy. I highly recommend her book as well. But that one person who for decades has blended in theory, courage, practicality, understands why we're doing this. This is for flexibility. I think there's just one. And she's amazingly generous with her insights. Callie Yost, who leads Flex Plus Strategy Group. I think she's the person I always look up.
I'm going to have to get Callie on the podcast after you said that. All right, final question. If people who have been listening want to learn more about you or know where you write or put out your thinking, where should they go to learn more about you or follow you?
There's a platform called LinkedIn. They should definitely add me there. And I post a lot there, but there's a lot of other stuff coming up around like videos and podcasting that I'll be posting there more frequently.
That's great. Well, Shujaat, it's such a pleasure. I find you incredibly insightful on this topic, and I think it's a great blueprint for people that are trying to figure out how to replicate some of the good work that LinkedIn has done internally on people analytics and advising the business. So thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me here. And again, likewise, I think the work you're doing, the insights, the research, I actively am using it. I think it's amazing. And I'm looking forward to a lot more being added there.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. All right, take care.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.